All right. Thank you for your patience. Madam Chair, welcome. As always, a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Let me ask you, if you could, just to direct the mic a little more toward you,
Okay.
so that folks
it.
watching could see it. We appreciate your being here, and we look forward to hearing about Senate Bill 69. We do not have a quorum at this point. We are one down. We anticipate somebody arriving within about 5 minutes, so I think we'll be in good shape.
All righty. Sounds good.
And the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Yes, ma'am.
Chairman and members of the committee. I appreciate the subcommittee meeting with me last week and having a hearing on Senate Bill 69. And I think it passed out unanimously through that subcommittee. Senate Bill 69 expands the definition of OCGA 19.7-5, and I do have a copy of that, I think, included in your folder. There were some questions about the child abuse laws, and this is concerning domestic relations and the parent and child relationship. This allows mandatory reporters, people such as doctors, nurses, teachers, school counselors, and social workers, to report all children that they believe are being commercially sexually exploited. Last year we had a study committee that met over the interim, and this was our #1 priority. We had 3 bills emerge out of that study committee, and fortunately we had working with us the Barton Child Clinic at Emory University, and they were the ones that actually brought up, along with Judge Rollins, the need for this expansion of the definition. What the study committee found, that there are approximately 200 to 300 young girls and boys, the ages of 12, 13, 14 years old, that are sexually exploited every month in the metropolitan Atlanta area. So we have lots of people who would like to testify, and I'll ask them to limit their remarks because I know you have a busy committee today. So we could talk all day about this issue, but we'll limit the remarks. And you should have some handouts in front of you also.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Questions for the author? Mr. Franklin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It looks like we're going from defining the conduct by the child's parent or caretaker to conduct by any person, which seems to be a relatively broad term. Is it your intent that if a child's friend says, hey, I just made X number of dollars selling myself, cool way to go to the mall and get some new clothes, that would definitely be encouraging that child to engage in prostitution? Are you trying to catch her best friend?
Well, it's basically kids that are actually taken in by pimps and sexually exploited and used as basically sex slaves is what our targeted population is, right, to get to the actual cause. But I think it would be, you have to actually turn in the case so that it would be investigated.
Right. I appreciate what you're attempting to do. I think sexually exploiting a child is pretty repugnant activity that needs to be punished. But I think by using that term, any person, might be a little broad, and maybe we should try to define specifically those who you are trying to target instead of just throwing out any person.
I think the Barton Clinic can talk about that and explain how we came up with that.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Abrams.
Thank you. Senator Underman, I think we discussed this in the subcommittee meeting. And just to clarify, is it not true that the term any person simply expands the ability of the mandatory reporter to, rather than wholly wait for a parent or a caretaker to be the person suspected of inducing a child into behavior, this simply allows the mandatory reporter to initiate investigations when there is a suspicion. So whether it's a fellow child who might be inciting the person to sexual exploitation, or an adult it simply allows the mandatory reporter to report those suspicions, to begin those investigations, that absent the change to any person, we may miss an entire segment of the population that may be engaging in that exploitive behavior, but it doesn't change the investigatory standards that would actually lead to the conviction of someone for the act of sexual exploitation.
That's exactly right.
Thank you.
And that got brought up in the subcommittee. And you defined it very well there, and you're defining it very well again. Thank you.
I should ask Chairman Ramsey. I know it came out of your subcommittee. I mean, do you have any comments on it? I don't mean to put you on the spot. I just
that was that Representative Franklin's question. Somebody in subcommittee asked almost that exact question, and Representative Abrams, what she just said is exactly right. It doesn't necessarily change the nature of what sexual exploitation is. It rather provides those that are required to report conduct a more expansive ability to do so when somebody other than the child's parent or caretaker are the ones that are engaging in the exploitive conduct.
And is the fork in the road then? It goes ahead and expands on the mandatory reporting, but then of course the good faith investigation occurs, right. And of course
there's steps along the way that certainly can flesh out
what's actual exploitation as opposed to children being foolish. I think,
right.
Just to get along the fact line of Representative Franklin. So I just want to make sure we sort of flesh that out.
That's exactly right.
All right. Mr. Knox. Thank you, Chairman Ramsey. Mr. Knox.
Mr. Chairman, I guess this may be a question more for the Legislative Council, as I think I need some legal advice and guidance here on the wording. And I have the same concerns about shifting this reporting requirement from the parents and the caretakers, because those are the people who actually have responsibility for doing it. They are required to do the same things that any person is going to be required to do in here, and we have some place to go to a fixed responsibility in that case. We know who a parent is and who a caretaker is. In other words, I think under the present law, the parent or caretaker is supposed to be responsible for making sure this doesn't happen. And if they are, then they're liable by virtue of the fact of the responsibilities placed on by law. If we look at the two words, allows and permits, any person allows and permits. What does that mean? Allows and permits. What would constitute allowing and permitting? I mean, that's a pretty broad term. That could mean almost anything. It just means not doing something. If you don't do something positively, you're allowing it to occur. I mean, if you have any knowledge of it whatsoever and you allow it to occur, we're expanding that to everybody that has knowledge of this has a requirement to do something about it, and they could be reported on by the reporters under that. It doesn't even have to be someone named. It could be somebody that the reporter sits there and says, well, so-and-so is any person, and they must be allowing this to occur, or it wouldn't be occurring because they live next door, or they go to school with the person, or that sort of thing. I'm not sure that is very clear to me how this is limited in any way. I understand what Representative Abrams said, but I'm not sure I find that in this new code.
Questions to council. I don't know who you are.
I think that the allowance and permits is given its normal meaning, just like what you said. I think you're right. It's broad.
So, for example, anybody the reporter thinks, and it's not just the parents or the caretaker, anybody the reporter thinks is allowing this or thinks is permitting some sort of behavior, they would be required and permitted to report them as somebody who has a duty or an obligation under this code section, whereas right now they don't.
I'm not quite sure I followed you on that one.
Okay. The mandatory reporter is going to have to decide under this who allows this and who permits it. Not just who's responsible, as in the case where it's the child's parents and caretaker. We know about them. We know who they are. We know they have a duty. Under this, we're going to require, that there's no decision that the reporter has to make. If they're the parent, they're the caretaker, they come under this. Now the reporter is going to have to make a decision about who these any persons are, and you're going to have to make a decision on what they're doing that allows or permits it, if anything. And, allow is not something you do actively. That's a passive state or condition of behavior. It's not doing something rather than doing something.
Well, there is, there are certain, I'm looking at the handout that they gave us in 1975, there are certain people that are required to report, and then there already is under subsection D, any other person who has reasonable cause to believe that the child is abused may report or cause reports to be made. So there is already some allowance for other persons to be involved.
Well, that's a different matter. Whether if it's any other person, if I'm a neighbor and I go to the mandatory reporter and tell them, look, I think this is information you need to have, that's one thing. But that's not what this is. This is saying that the mandatory reporter is supposed to impose the same responsibility on any person that the law has previously imposed only on the parent or the caretaker, as I read it.
I'm reading it the same way you are, Representative Knox, but I have a feeling that Widener is not. So.
I'm just saying it's different than what they've said before and what we've understood before, where it's okay for somebody to go report something. That's not what this is. This is not the same thing at all. Correct?
Ms. Abrams, you look like you were burning to chime in on that exact point, and then if Chairwoman Underman has a guest witness she'd like to fill in on that, how about if we go that way?
Thank you. And actually, I have some questions I'd like to ask, which I think will eliminate the issue.
Okay.
And the young woman who's joined us is from the Barton Clinic and actually worked on the law. So if I may direct my questions to both Senator Underman and
sure.
So the first question is, can you explain what the current mandatory reporting law does?
Absolutely. The mandatory reporting...
And if you could introduce yourself for members of the committee. That's all right.
My name is Kirsten Widener, and I'm an attorney with the Barton Child Law and Policy Clinic at Emory University's Law School. And we did work on an extensive report that we wrote over the course of 3 years on this subject, and have done extensive research on the use of mandatory child abuse reporting bills to identify children who have been involved in commercial sexual exploitation. This is an approach that's being used successfully in other jurisdictions, including in Massachusetts. To Representative Abrams' specific question, the mandatory child abuse reporting law does not create any duty on any person, and it does not create any culpability in terms of the person who is abusing the child. All it does is create a mechanism for a child who has been abused to be identified and reported to authorities so that that child can be protected and provided with services. So it is true, as Representative Knox points out, that this law does expand the definition so that the mandatory reporter doesn't have to think about who's doing the exploiting. And that was very intentional because we don't want the mandatory reporter to go through that analysis. We simply want them to report that a child has been abused so that the appropriate investigation can take place and that services can be offered to that child.
If I can follow up.
Sure.
So to restate what you said, under the current law, if a person who is not the parent or caretaker either induces, allows, permits, or encourages a young person to engage in prostitution, right now a mandatory reporter, a teacher, a nurse, a doctor, or a law enforcement person cannot use the mandatory reporting laws to report that person. And this would alter it to say that the mandatory reporting laws covers any abuse, any encouragement or inducement of either prostitution or of sexual exploitation that includes visual media. That person now has the affirmative obligation, if they see this abuse taking place, to do mandatory reporting, because it's not simply limited to the parent inducing it or the caretaker inducing it. It expands it to cover anybody who might be encouraging, inducing, allowing, or permitting this behavior. Doesn't create a new conduct standard for the person. It creates a new reporting obligation for the mandatory reporters, which are these three groups of people who are obliged to protect children in our system, correct?
That's exactly right. It, particularly with doctors, social workers, counselors, people who are generally bound by a duty of confidentiality. Right now, unless an act is covered by the mandatory reporting statute, those people are not able to report child abuse. And so this brings the broader exploitation of children under that immunity from being sued for breaching confidentiality.
And if I can ask one final question. To Mr. Knox's concern about this, and I think also the legitimate concerns raised by both Representative Knox and Representative Franklin about being expansive, is it not true that what this bill does is permits the protection of children, and while that there are some potential categories of persons who can be captured by allows or permits when the mandatory reporter is considering making that report, this in no way expands the ability of law enforcement to capture persons for that activity. They still have to. This changes the mandatory reporting law, saying that if you think this is happening, you've got to report it. But on the other side, when it comes to adjudication of the issue, you still have to follow the same exact standards that exist today, and those standards aren't being expanded in any way. So if you haven't engaged in the behavior that is defined, you cannot now be prosecuted for behavior because we have not changed the underlying law.
That's correct. We're not changing either the deprivation standard under Title 15, Chapter 11, or the criminal standard under Title 16. So all the culpability remains the same. This is only changing the duty on mandatory child abuse.
Which is still subject to all investigation of the facts wherever they may go. Let me ask Chairman Knox. I think it'd be, if he wants to follow up on his point as relates to the dialogue that y'all have had.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand what y'all are saying. What I'm saying to you, however, is when you use terms like allows and permits, you're expanding the universe. And when and maybe you can, I might be wrong about this, but when the mandated reporter gives this information, they give specific information to law enforcement. They don't just say, I think a child's being abused and you ought to look into it, do they?
The call goes to DHR, not to law enforcement. So it would go first to the Department of Family and Children's Services. They will determine whether or not there is abuse that warrants a call to law enforcement.
Well, what are they going to tell DHR?
So it varies widely. The mandatory reporter is required to tell DHR that they suspect child abuse is occurring. They're not required to give, to name specific people. And what we were trying to avoid was having the mandatory reporter have to go through that analysis of who is exploiting the child, to have to even think about that. Instead, just to identify the child and report them so that an investigation can be conducted.
They are not required, I understand, to give them specific information, but the whole point of the mandated reporter is to allow them to, if they have the information in specificity, they can give it to DHR, they can give it to the Sheriff's Department, whoever, because the Sheriff's Department is going to call them and say, tell us what this is about. Who's involved, da-da-da-da, correct?
They definitely should give information that will be helpful to both DHR and law enforcement in determining who might be at fault in the situation, but the focus is on reporting the child.
I understand that. I understand what the purpose is, but getting to the goal is real important. What we do to get there is real important. And if we're now allowing the mandated reporter to make decisions about what basically is facts and information that constitutes probable cause for an investigation on people who are not related to the child at all. They're not relatives. They might not be neighbors. They might just be somebody that heard it from somebody else. And those people are now subject to this, made part of this investigation.
If I hear, let me just follow up on that. If I hear Chairman Knox's point, I mean, I think I understand it. It does open up a lot more expansively the ability for someone to potentially make an irresponsible report. But of course, arguing against that, of course, we don't want. There's a good faith belief and an unreasonable suspicion can sometimes be a fine line between the two. Arguing against myself, of course, then of course, it still is subject to the same fact-based investigation by whoever, whether it's DHR or local authorities, whatever it may be. And so the question is, on what side do we err? Chairman Ramsey.
I wait. I think y'all stated the
Mr. Levitas.
Wait.
Mr. Franklin. Wait. I'm on a roll. Mr. Knox, let me ask, did you have any follow-up on that?
No, I think I'm done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Abrams, and then we'll get to the next witness.
Oh, they're witnesses. At the appropriate time, I'd like to be recognized for a motion.
Yes, ma'am. Let me ask, before we go ahead, let me ask Judge Rawlings, if you would, just to come up, and of course, completely ambushed, not warning him of that I would call him up here, but if you could just take a few minutes, I think it would be helpful.
Thank you.
Perspective, if you want to comment on the dialogue that we've had just now, just in general, let me ask you to limit it, if you could, just a few minutes.
Thanks so much.
I'm
Tom Rawlings,
move on from there.
Child advocate, former juvenile court judge, resident of Sandersville, Georgia, Washington County, and I want to give you a Washington County example. First of all, right now, this is not a bill about making somebody report something. It is to some extent true. It's a mandated reporting bill.
It's a discretion to report.
The reality of it on the current law is this. My brother is a psychiatrist and practiced psychiatry in Sandersville for a long time. Let's say he had a patient who came in. The patient said, "Doc, I am depressed." "Why are you depressed, young lady?" "Because I'm 16 years old and my father is either prostituting me out to his friends, or I think the second one is taking pornographic pictures of me." Now, or allowing his friends to take pornographic pictures. Those are clearly, under current law, defined as something that the doctor can breach that confidentiality and say to the DFACS or whomever, "Look, we got a situation where a little girl's being abused. Her parent, her caretaker, is allowing her to be prostituted or to be photographed pornographically, etc. This is a bad situation." The doctor or the school counselor or the nurse, whomever, is freed from the fear of being sued in order to be allowed to tell someone that we have a victim. And to respond to your concern, Chairman Knox, it has to be a reasonable basis. It has to be made basically in good faith. You have to have some specificity. You can't say, "I feel like this girl must have had something happen to her." It's got to be something specific. Now, that's the current law. The dilemma that we have faced, I think that Ms. Widener, the Barton Clinic, and Chairwoman Underman have tried to deal with is this. My brother, or my friend who's a school counselor in Sandersville, had the same problem, but the little girl, instead of saying, "My father is allowing this to happen," or "My caretaker is allowing this to happen," says, "I have a friend who's 35 years old, and he is paying me to have pictures of myself put on the internet. And it's making me really depressed, or because of what he's done to me, I've gotten really sick, and I can't do my schoolwork, etc." Under current law, the fact that this person is not a guardian, parent, or caretaker means that the same professional cannot tell anyone. And that, to me, is a difference that is, quite frankly, unreasonable. Because if we have specific, as you acknowledge, Chairman Knox, if we have specific grounds to reasonably believe that a child is being, and we're not talking about any kind of sex. In fact, there is a specific exemption in the law currently for sex between minors, stuff that goes on between children. But if we have reasonable grounds, and I'll point you to lines 18 through 22 of the bill, we have reasonable grounds to believe that anyone is allowing or permitting a child to be prostituted or is allowing or permitting a child to be put in a porno movie, child kiddie porn, then somebody needs to know about that. And we don't need to have the school counselor or the nurse or the doctor or the psychiatrist say, oh, well, I'd love to report this, but I'm so afraid of being sued. We need to free them up from that burden of knowing that knowledge that somebody needs to know, and we need to give them the freedom to be able to report it. And that's really what this bill does.
Questions for Judge Rawlings? Seeing none, thank you for the perspective. Judge Quillian Baldwin has entered the room. Good to see you, sir. Let me, is it Kathy McCullough? Kathy? Oh, there's two F's right there.
Yeah.
Oh, it is. Okay. Kathy. Yes, ma'am. Welcome.
Thank
Let me ask you to limit your comments to just a few minutes, if you would.
In fact, I will. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I really, the Juvenile Justice Fund and the Future Not Past is totally behind this bill. I don't think there's really any need for me to add any more clarity. We need more people able to report this crime.
Thank you. Mr. Wendell Phillips with the Presbytery of Greater Atlanta. And let me ask you too, sir, if you would just limit your comments to a few minutes.
My name is Wendell Phillips. I'm the public policy advocate for the Presbytery of Greater Atlanta, and I'll simply echo what Kathy McCullough just said. I think the case has been made extremely well and articulately. We would simply like to be on record as being in favor of Senate Bill 69 with great appreciation for the hard work that's gone into developing it and for the results that we are sure will occur because it's been enacted. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Is there anyone else? I'm sorry. There was Alyssa Parsons with the Barton Child Law and Policy Clinic. Ms. Parsons, was your portion covered by Ms. Widener? Would you like to go ahead and be heard?
I'd like to add 2 more points.
Well, come on up. With my usual cautionary, just a few minutes, if you would.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Alyssa Parsons, and I'm actually a student intern with the Barton Child Law and Policy Clinic. Much of what I already wanted to discuss we have covered here in this discussion, but I'd like to add just 2 more points of clarification to this discussion. The first thing that I'd like to add is that this change would bring in the mandatory reporting law for commercial sexual exploitation. It would make it consistent with the mandatory reporting law for sexual abuse of children. Currently, the mandatory reporting law for child sexual abuse requires that whoever is sexually abusing a child, regardless of who is abusing that child, mandatory reporters need to report that. Because commercial sexual exploitation of children is defined as a child sexual abuse, this would allow the mandatory reporters to continue in that consistency and also report regardless of who is commercially sexually exploiting the child. Additionally, Prevent Child Abuse Georgia has agreed to do the training to ensure that mandatory reporters know what should and should not be reported.
Thank you. Questions from Ms. Parsons? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who would like to be heard on Senate Bill 69? Yes, ma'am. Please come forward and let us know who you are and my cautionary of just a few minutes, if you would, so we can make sure we get to Senator Butler's bill as well.
It will be quite brief.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Pamela Perkins, and I'm the coordinator for the Interfaith Children's Movement, which is an advocacy movement for children comprised of various faith communities throughout Georgia. And we want to go on record as being in support of Senate Bill 69 because, as I've stated, we are a children's movement, and our concern is the safety and well-being of all of Georgia's children. So we ask your support for that. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Is there anyone else who would like to be heard on Senate Bill 69? Seeing none, what is the pleasure of the committee? Ms. Abrams.
I'd like to
Let me ask the gentlelady just to suspend for 1 second. Mr. Bearden had a question. I'm sorry. I thought it was a...
Just as Senator, did I hear you correctly saying Massachusetts is the only other state that has this type of language?
I'm not sure about that. I think the Barton Clinic had done the research on it.
I just know Massachusetts was said earlier, and I thought they said that was the only other state that had this type of language.
Mr. Chairman,
Sure.
can I make The Massachusetts statute actually reads very differently, but they have been using it. They've trained their mandatory reporters to use their statute in this way. Their language is actually much, much broader than the language here, which is basically that if anyone reasonably suspects that any harm is being done to a child, it must be reported, which is breathtakingly broad and much further than we're going.
Thank you. Ms. Abrams.
I'd like to move to pass of LC 293722S.
Move to pass by Ms. Abrams of SB 69.
Mr. Chairman, could I just reiterate that in our study committee we found that generally Georgia's laws on child protection and I think Judge Rollins will agree with me across the whole United States that our laws are less restrictive and have less mandates than most other states. And I think he would agree with me. And that's what our study committee found.
Thank you. There is a motion by Ms. Abrams. There's a second by Mr. Ramsey. Are there any amendments? Mr. Franklin.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to propose an amendment to the language since it's the same in sections 1, 2, and 3. So it would cover all three, where we would retain the words child's parent or caretaker, and then add any person for commercial purposes, so that line would read sexual exploitation means conduct by a child's parent or caretaker or any person for commercial purposes who allows, and so forth. Since that seems to be the thrust of the people proposing the bill.
So the way the gentleman's amendment would read is sexual, and this would go uniformly in sections 1, 2, and 3. Sexual exploitation means conduct by a child's parent or caretaker or any person for commercial purposes who allows, permits, encourages, etc. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Discussion on the amendment, Mr. Levitas?
To the author, am I correct in assuming you don't care whether the parent is doing it for commercial purposes or not? We want to prohibit. So I guess to the author of the amendment, if what you're trying to do is get any person for commercial purposes, then I would put that before a child's parent or caretaker. So it would be by any person for commercial purposes or a child's parent or caretaker who allows. Because
that is my intent.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
I don't know what commercial purposes would be. I would say that some people, whether it's a parent or a caretaker or any person, they're just doing this maliciously, and they may not be making money off of it. They may be just doing it to get a kick out of doing it, and I don't know what the definition of commercial is. To me, commercial means you're making money, but some people don't make money out of it. They just do it to get their kicks out of it.
So I hear if I hear you correctly, Madam Chair, your response to the amendment would be that by adopting an amendment in some form as it's been discussed just now, it actually limits the reporting that would occur because it would narrow it simply for commercial, for making money, mercantile commercial purposes, however one wants to describe that, as opposed to capturing more conduct, which is capturing potentially more conduct, which is the overall intent of the bill.
Some people are sick. They're obviously sick, or else they wouldn't be engaging in this kind of activity, and it's repetitious. They do it repeatedly because they do like to do it, obviously.
Mr. Ramsey.
I would be concerned about
just a quick point that the whole thrust of this is to keep these reporters from having to engage in a analysis of what's going on. By adding commercial, we're adding another layer of complexity that would require the reporters to determine, is this for commercial purposes or not, and you're going to have kids slip through the cracks, and that's the whole goal of this. So,
Ms. Abrams.
What he said.
Mr. Franklin.
Yeah,
and then we'll go ahead and take a vote.
Then I'm just confused because I heard yourself and several of the testifiers talk about commercial exploitation, and now we're saying it's not about commercial exploitations. I'm wondering what's the purpose that you're
I
trying
think
to
it's
accomplish?
about exploitation in general.
It seems to be changing.
It's any exploitation, whether it's for commercial purposes or not.
Right. Right. And I'm sorry if I gave that. It's just that our study committee, as we began the study committee, we began focusing on prostitution and illegal prostitution, and that's what the study committee was about. And that was the name of the study committee. And I think that's where the commercialism came in. But that was not our original intention, and if I gave that, I'm sorry.
We have a motion. We have a second. We have a proposed amendment by Mr. Franklin. Mr. Franklin, would you like to pursue the amendment?
I didn't understand the question.
Would you like to? We have you've proposed an amendment. Would you like to pursue the amendment after this discussion?
I can withdraw it.
Gentleman withdraws his amendment. Are there any further amendments proposed? Seeing none, there's a motion and a second of due pass by Senate Bill 69 LC 293722 S parentheses SCS. I was looking at Ms. Travis to make sure that we're on the same page. Any further discussion? All in favor, please signify by raising your right hand, or your left hand if you prefer. Opposed? The motion is adopted, and Senate Bill 69 will be reported as due pass.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And I appreciate the questions.
Senator Butler. The committee has Senate Bill 4 under consideration by Senator Butler. Senator Butler, welcome and good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you for hearing my bill so quickly. We just got it out of subcommittee on Friday with a unanimous vote. And it's an easy bill. It's not one like we just had, but the bill allows for a person that takes out a temporary protective order to be notified when that order is served. The person that takes out the order have to leave their information, such as a cell phone number or email address, so they can be notified by the department that their protective order has been served on the person that they took it out on. And I would just ask for your favorable vote. If there are questions, I'll be happy to try and answer.
Mr. Ramsey.
Time, I'd like to be recognized for a motion.
Very well, Mr. Levitas.
You know, I love this bill, and I told you that with subcommittee, and I do. My only question is, and maybe you know the answer, maybe you don't, but I want to make sure that whatever information is provided to the sheriff or deputy sheriff, whatever, is not in any way subject to release or discovery. Do you know whether does anybody have an opinion on that? That's my only concern about the bill, is whether we need to add language that just says, you know, such information shall not be disclosed to any person unless, I don't even know what the circumstance would be subpoenaed. Do you have an opinion?
Isn't a protective order, Ms. Travis, isn't that subject to open record and discovery anyway? I mean,
don't know.
Is that a protected document? Oh, yeah, right. Assume, yeah.
And I guess if it is sealed, again, I don't want to hold up the bill. I just don't want to put the person in a position of somehow wanting to be notified they've gone to the trouble of moving, and then somehow the person who's the subject of the protective order can get the information, either the address or the cell phone. And again, if I'm overthinking this, I do not want to stand in the way of a good bill. I just want to make sure we're covering that person. And if we want to deal with it next year, that's fine as well. I just throw that out there for the committee's consideration.
Ms. Travis, you have any thoughts on that? Or?
If the information is given to the sheriff or a marshal, it could somehow be subject to an open records request if the person was knowledgeable.
Does anybody have an opinion about whether we could statutorily exempt that from open records?
Speaking for myself, I'd be hesitant about anything limiting open open records, especially when you've got the mechanism of the judge sealing the...
It looks like the author of the committee has an opinion.
Ms. Abrams?
My point would be, I think to Mr. Levitas' concern, all this does is allow the sheriff to contact by telephonic or electronic means. They're not transmitting any information, they're simply conveying the existence of the protective order, that it's been issued. So I think your concern, while well taken, may be a bit more expansive than necessary, because this isn't that they're transmitting this information and therefore creating a paper trail that could be discoverable under the sunshine laws. It simply says that when the order is issued, the sheriff can call you and tell you that it's been issued, if I'm correct.
Then how would they have that information? I'm assuming somebody's going to write that down and put it in a record. Again, I don't want to hold up the bill. It's just my concern, having seen enough of these cases as a prosecutor, folks will go to all kinds of means to get that information.
I guess my point would be, and Senator Butler can correct me if I'm wrong, but the sheriff or deputy sheriff is going to receive this information because they're the ones serving the protective order. So they've already got this information. If there's any discovery, that discovery exists by virtue of the protective order. What this simply does is add a second step, that after the service of the protective order, the person serving the order then is required to provide notification, because under current law, the service can be done, but you may not know unless you call in and ask if it's been served. So you're not creating any new information or any new transmit.
I'm sorry, they've already got that information to contact. Okay.
Yeah, because they're actually serving the order.
Okay. Thanks.
Just a logistical question. Notification shall only be made if the protected person has requested notification, has provided a telephone number or email to the sheriff for purposes of notification. Senators,
it protects the person
if they've made that request.
If they need to find a safe place to be,
right,
after they find out that that order has been served on the person.
I always get not hung up, but concerned about he said, she said situations, even in simple situations like that, where what if the sheriff didn't get the message or didn't, a verification that they've received that particular request, and just in terms of seamless communication. And I wonder, do you have any conversations? And I see Judge Baldwin is just almost beside himself. But
no, I didn't.
Sure, come on up if you wouldn't mind, Judge.
I don't mind at all.
But I'm William Baldwin. I'm one of the Superior Court judges in the Coweta Circuit. What usually happens, at least in our circuit, and I don't have any idea about in the bigger cities, but somebody comes to us to get an order signed, and there's a place on the form that says the address is to be kept confidential if they want it confidential. Now, in a lot of cases, they don't care whether it's confidential, but there is a place to do that. Usually what happens is we have a hearing almost within just a few days. Sometimes maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks at the most. And, they get served with these things, and I reckon a number could be given that is not this person's number. It could be a friend or a parent or somebody like that. If they want to use a telephone number or an email address, they don't have to use their own. A lot of these people probably don't have email addresses that I see. So, as a practical matter, I don't know if it makes a lot of difference. I suspect if the sheriff's department gets it, or whoever's going to serve it, they're not going to write it down on anything but a piece of paper or something,
And that was my concern,
I don't think
logistically.
They're going to put it in the record, but they could. I suppose they could.
And this really goes to the receiving of accurate information, receiving the request. And I see the sheriffs are not signed up to speak. The Sheriff's Association is not signed up to speak. Any reaction from
the sheriff
that you care to share on that, just on the logistics of it, just to make sure it works?
They didn't mind the bill. They were at the subcommittee meeting. They were at the Public Safety Committee meeting in the Senate when I
no objection.
passed the bill. No objection.
Okay, just want to cover that base. Mr. Lunsford. Oh, I'm sorry. Ms. Benfield.
I'm just wondering, instead of dealing with the Open Records Act exemptions, which get me a little nervous as well, if we would just want to add, I don't even know if it's necessary, but add, said contact information shall be kept confidential upon request, or something to that extent. But I don't want to, again, mess with the bill unnecessarily.
Ms. Abrams.
As a person who had as my prior experience protecting and responding to open records requests, I would advise against carving out any confidentiality language that may conflict with the sunshine laws, because you create a whole new slew of unintended consequences.
I mean, it's effectively done by sealing of the record anyway.
Exactly.
If Judge Baldwin or any other judge wants or needs to do that.
And I would reiterate, I don't think it's necessary. I think what this allows is simply a second step of notification. I don't think it creates any cause of action against the sheriff for failure to comply, but it does at least give them. I think it puts them on notice that they should do this, and I think it's a fairly simple, straightforward proposition.
Thank you. It's always good to flesh out the law, ensuring that the law of unintended consequences doesn't kick in. Any further questions for the author? Seeing none, thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Shelley Centerfit?
Mr. Chairman.
And with the usual cautionary.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm with the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence.
Please come up so we can hear, or so the microphone people don't call us and complain.
With the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, we thank Senator Butler for bringing the bill and support it. I would just add, with respect to this question of the confidentiality of information, we will certainly be training our advocates who accompany victims when they seek a protective order about the fact that this information could be discovered, and so they may want to use the advocate's phone number if there is a concern about the respondent finding their personal information or a friend's number if there's anything that's recommended. So.
Questions for Ms. Centerfit? Thank you, ma'am. Kirsten, I can't read the last name. Rambo, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm Kirsten Rambo. I'm the Executive Director of the Georgia Commission on Family Violence. We're the state agency dedicated to ending family violence in Georgia. And all I wanted to say is that we wholeheartedly support the bill. We think it's a great bill, an important bill, and we want to thank Senator Butler for bringing it.
Thank you.
Questions for Ms. Rambo? Thank you.
Thank you.
What is the will of the committee? Mr. Ramsey.
Move to pass Senate Bill 4, SB 4/FA.
There is a move. There is a second. Are there any amendments? Hearing none, any further discussion on the bill? Seeing no requests on the gentleman's motion of do pass Senate Bill 4, all in favor, please signify by raising your hand. Opposed? And the motion is adopted unanimously. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
We'll go ahead and adjourn. We're going to meet tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. on Senate Bill 151, and the agenda is subject to change depending on circumstances later on today. Thank you.